Well, thank you, Dragos, for the invitation to speak about this very difficult treaty called the Quaestiones supra Librum de causis, assigned to Roger Bacon. And I will evoke, first of all, shortly the context. If I turn my head, it's only because I'm reading a text on the other side of my computer, because I didn't find the way to share my screen in two parts. Anyway, well, so I'm not angry. I'm just reading my text. So to evoke shortly the context, there is only one copy of the Quaestiones supra Librum de causis that has been found in a manuscript in Amiens, 406, described by Victor Cousin in the Journal des Savants in the 19th century. This manuscript is incomplete. Several parts of the text are missing, and one question of the commentary of the question 4 is left, but the rest is lacking until question 8. The edition that has been made at the beginning of the 20th century by Steele and Delorme, called Opera Actinus Inedita, gives the following order, as you can see on the document. That is not a chronological order, and that needs to be revised actually with the help of recent researchers, especially the researchers of Silvia Donati, who has shown that in an article of 2013, who has shown that several treatises are inauthentic. The Quaestiones supra undecimum primae philosophiae Aristotelis, the Quaestiones supra libros quatuor physicorum Aristotelis, and the Quaestiones altere supra libros primae philosophiae Aristotelis. Nevertheless, some specialists are still comparing these treatises. For example, Cecilia Trifogli, who compares some inauthentic treatises in an article about the dimensions of the question of the dimensions. So even if there are new researches on this matter, the treatises are still interesting. Dragos, I quote you, Dragos points out in an article that still no agreement exists concerning the dating of the Quaestiones supra Librum de causis. Actually, there is still 3 possibilities. The first one is the one of the editor Steele, who sets it up between 1241 and 1245. Weinsteinbergen around 1250, and Silvia Donati around 1246 or 7. One thing is sure, nevertheless, Timothy Noon says that Rufus' commentary and Bacon's Quaestiones are of the same period, around 1240 or 50. Researches on these Researches on these treatises are still in progress, and I'm working on a revision of the edition of the Quaestiones supra Librum de causis. I'm trying to revise this edition because it is quite complicated because of the many gaps that are in the manuscript and the difficulty of the doctrine that is explained in the text. My presentation will focus on the analysis of the first part of the commentary of the first proposition of the libre de causis if the first cause inflows more than the second cause. Bacon actually divides his commentary of this proposition in 2 parts. The first one is the preliminary part and wishes to define what is a causality by influence with the help of the Aristotelian classification of 4 causes. The second one answers to the question if the first cause inflows more than the second one. This first part is particularly dense and difficult to understand, but is interesting in many ways. Firstly, Bacon intends here to clarify the notion of influence, influentia. He proceeds certainly not as systematically as Albert the Great will proceed several decades later in his treatise De Fluxus, but nevertheless, this analysis helps to identify fundamental features and characteristics of the notion of influence. The notion of influentia is analyzed only in the Quaestiones on the causis and not in the other treatises of the same period. It is maybe of great interest to notice that the definition of the causality by influence sits precisely in a metaphysical commentary as the Quaestiones on Librum de causis. Moreover, the definition of the causality by influence helps to articulate the creative causality of the first cause with the causality of the creatures. The influence comes in many views. The influence of the first cause isn't exactly that of the universal causes. That isn't exactly the same as the particular causes. But a generic concept seems nevertheless to emerge from this analysis. Eventually, the questions belong to a neglected period of Bacon's works and is of peculiar doctrinal interest. Because the first part that I propose to analyze today is far from easy, I propose to work as follows. I tried to pick up some elements in the rest of the Quaestiones to clarify some passages of the commentary of the first proposition. So I will quote passages of the commentary of the first proposition, but also passages of the text of the rest of the text. Secondly, to compare, I have tried to compare Bacon's Quaestiones to the pseudo-Henry's commentary, not in the details, but anyway, because the pseudo-Henry's commentary has disturbing similarities with Bacon's commentary, and has the advantage of being far clearer than the Bacon's Quaestiones. So the Henry's commentary is systematic, but with the table that you see on the slide, it will help to clarify some passages. Thirdly, I will try to analyze the text, so the first part of the commentary of the first proposition of libre de causis, with the help of three notions recognized as peculiar to Bacon's works by the specialists. The first notion, Yael Kedra, says that the species, which is a kind of active force emitted by an influencing agent, is not only an intentional being, but has a form and a kind of matter. And this is specific to Roger Bacon in comparison with the other Franciscan authors. Secondly, second element, this particularity leads to define the inflow of virtus, the virtus which is synonym with species, as a multiplication or spread of species. And third element, this mechanism of spread requires in turn a potentia activa inside the matter, which is an active power, which is not the power of the form, but is specific to the matter. And Anna Rodolphi argues that the potentia activa is brought by Bacon as an innovation in the Franciscan theories. So three elements, three concepts to try to understand the structure and the meaning of this first part of the commentary of the first proposition. Well, just a little remark. I won't read all the quotations because, as you can see, there are many pages. So my only hope is that we can come to an end with this analysis. But anyway, I put a table on all the slides with, on the left, the Quaestiones supra Librum de causis of Roger Bacon, and on the right, the Quaestiones in Librum de causis of Pseudo-Henry. And I tried to underline the important quotations in both texts. As we can see, the Bacon's Quaestiones don't offer an introduction as the Pseudo-Henry's commentary does about what is the science of causes. Nevertheless, this kind of introduction can be found in the Quaestiones supra Metaphysica Aristotelis. This is an interesting fact because several elements in the Quaestiones of in Bacon's Quaestiones show that this treatise about metaphysics should be before, chronologically before the Quaestiones supra Librum de causis. The answer to the question if the first cause inflows more than the second one is dilated further. Actually, Bacon, as Pseudo-Henry, actually, begins with another question. Does every cause cause by influence? This seems to be logical, because if the influence of the first cause is greater than the influence of the second one must also inflow. But it supposes also that every cause is to be said to inflow, that is, the first cause and all the natural causes. In the analysis of the Quaestiones, these causes are divided following the Aristotelian classification, ordered as this: matter, efficient causes, formal causes, and final causes. This classification is itself grafted on Neoplatonical classification between superior and inferior causes, that is, between the universal and particular causes. Thus, we have a strange structure as this: the first cause, then the matter, then, maybe because of the representation of creation, the corporeal substances, incorporeal substances, and the artificial agents, and then the formal and the final causes. And there is an interruption, if I can say, so to speak, which is a resumption of the explanation just in the middle of the structure, just after the explanation about the artificial substances, with another classification, that is, a distinction between the universal and the particular causes, and the distinction between the external and the internal causes. Well, I give you the structure before, so that you can imagine how complicated is the structure. Well, the first question is about the first cause, like in Pseudo-Henry commentary. And the first argument, which is contra, says that the first cause acts only with its will, and because its will is infinite, it is unlimited, nor does anything resist it. The argument is here: causa prima agit per solam voluntatem, voluntati causae primae cum sit infinita nihil resistit. I cut the quotation so that you don't have the other part of the quotation, but the other part of the quotation only explains that the first cause isn't limited by anything. If the first cause isn't limited by anything, any intermediate principle is excluded in the operation of creation. This means that the first cause doesn't require and even excludes the intervention of any other efficient cause in the creation. Nevertheless, as explained in the second argument and the solution, here in the quotation, the first cause cannot inform things itself. A principle of information is needed, which isn't an intermediate principle in its act and doesn't limit it in its act. Therefore, it can be said, even if the text doesn't say it explicitly, that the first cause acts by its will and by influence, thanks to a principle of information. But what is this principle of information, and how does it come from the first cause? Here it is necessary to pick up some elements further in the Quaestiones. And the quotations are here. I put many quotations here with the first quotation, which is illud quod continuat esse creaturae immediate est informativum principium illius cuius esse continuat, etc. First of all, the first cause is not a principle of information itself, because it doesn't inform directly creatures. That is, it doesn't act directly in creatures. This could be a feature of its transcendence. To inform creature, means here to complete their being in generation. Thus, there are two acts, one of creation, which is without any intermediate principle, and another of information, which helps creatures in their generation. It is here that the principle of information is needed. This need of a principle of information is not because of the incapacity of the first cause, but because of the destitution of the creature, their lack in being, because they have been created from nothing. Such a principle of information is necessary because of the incapacity of the creatures, and not because of the incapacity of the first cause. I underlined the quotation. Said, it is at the very end of the last quotation here on the slide, sed hoc non est propter impotentiam eius vel indigentiam, sed propter impotentiam ipsius creaturae et indigentiam exigitur aliquod principium informativum. Sorry for the French accent when reading Latin. I hope it, it doesn't disturb you. Well, what is this principle of information? A virtus, that is, a similitude of the agent that has itself a force. The problem is this one. If something is emitted or diffused by the first cause, this could not be a matter, because a matter doesn't inform anything, nor a form, because the form is what completes the creature after its final constitution, nor the substance, which is composed of matter and form. If it isn't a substance, it is not so far an accident, because the virtus emitted by the first cause has the same nature and the same essence as esse, says Roger Bacon, which is nor a substance nor an accident, but something substantial. I put the quotation here later. Is the second quotation here, beginning with ad aliud dicendum, quod non valet hoc argumentum, hoc virtus non est materia nec forma nec compositum, ergo est accidem, non est falsa, quoniam esse non est accident, et tamen nullum historum est, sed est substantiale cui libet, enti. Similiter dico de virtute, sorry for the mistake, infusa ad continuendum esse, nam ipsa et est eiusdem naturae et essentiae, cum ipso esse. Ideo, uius modi virtus, nec substantia nec accident est proprie, sed aliquid substantiale sicut ipsum esse. Sorry for the mistakes in the text. But then, how does the first cause emit a principle of information if it doesn't diffuse it? The first cause cannot emit a virtus or a species because its species is its own substance. Another quotation says, quoniam species primi est substantia eius. The first cause then creates the virtus. And we see it in the first quotation here. Sorry. Si aliquid diffundat ipsum primum ad continuendum esse creaturae, in generation, necesse est illud de novo generari sive creari, unde proprie loquendo a primo nihil diffunditur, sed extendendo nomen diffusionis diffunditur ab ipso virtus continuans esse et informans esse creaturae. Actually, Bacon recognizes two senses to the diffusion of something. The first sense is the diffusion of itself extra se, by the means of something, and this is not the case of the first cause. The second sense is per generationem sui sibi similis ex nihilo, that is, by creation of a trace, a vestigium of itself. And this is the quotation here. So, the two quotations talk about the particular diffusion. The diffusion is particular to the first cause, which is not a diffusion from itself, extra itself, outside itself, but that is a real creation of a vestigium in the intelligence. We will see later all the consequences of these affirmations. Here on the following page, I won't spend many time to read all the quotations because we have a gap, a difference between the Quaestiones supra Librum de causis on Roger Bacon's side and the Pseudo-Henry Quaestiones in Librum de causis. The structure between both commentary is quite different. When Pseudo-Henry's immediately talks about the efficient causes, the other efficient causes than the first one, actually the intelligences and the celestial bodies, Roger Bacon follows the commentary with the matter, the question of matter. So there is a shift between both commentary so that we can find arguments in Pseudo-Henry's Quaestiones earlier that are later in the commentary of in Roger Bacon's commentary. So I put the page here. You will have the slides to read it in detail, but I don't read the quotations of Pseudo-Henry. The second question is about matter. And the first argument says, which is pro, says that the matter inflows because if the form is the act of matter and that the form cannot act without material conditions, then the matter does also flow. Nulla forma quae est actus materiae facit se sine conditione materia, sed forma quae est actus materiae potest facere se extra se per diffusionem sui, et sic erit diffusio virtutis ex parte materiae et ex parte forma. As we can see, this argument includes actually two elements. The first one is the answer to the question, does the matter flow as a cause by influence? And the second is the consequence of this answer, because if the matter flows as the form does, then the similitude of the agent, that is composed of matter and form as a substance, that is, this similitude, the species, this similitude then is also composed of form and matter. This consequence isn't asserted as such in the text, but it is said that diffusio virtutis will be ex parte materiae et ex parte formae. This is an argument. This is not Bacon's solution. The second argument, contra, doesn't notice this element. It only says that the matter is in itself something receptive that cannot act in any way. And this is this last argument that is conceded by Bacon. Potest concedi potentum habet potentiam receptivam, ideo non potest se facere extra se potentiam diffusivam, extra se active. But the answer to the arguments that follows is more interesting. Certainly the matter doesn't flow because it is only receptive, but something else is conceded insofar as the matter can be considered as flowing subjective, that is as a subject, whereas the influence is mostly due to the form which flows actively. This concession means that even if the matter isn't an active cause, the operation of the form cannot occur if there are no material conditions. The hylomorphism of Bacon implies that every form always has a kind of material condition. In this case, the similitude of the agent, which is itself a composition of matter and form, as it is the substance, is itself, the similitude, composed of matter and form. Or let's say that the similitude of the agent is similitudo expressa totius agentis, as is said at the end of the quotations, umne quod derelinquitur ex aliquo est similitudo expressa totius agentis. But this needs some further explanation. Is the species a substance composed of matter and form? A few words have to be said here. In the Quaestiones, in the rest of the Quaestiones, the species is presented as a synonym of virtus, similitudo, vestigium, esse intenzionale, quasi substantiale. I didn't find any precise definition of the species in this treaty, as we can find in Bacon's later works, such as the Communium Naturalium or in the De Multiplicatione Specierum. The different elements given in the text, it is possible to give the species is a virtus. Sorry, the connection seems to have some problem. The species is a virtus means that it's not only a representation emitted by an agent. It is also a similitude or a vestigium of this agent, like an image. Because it is a similitude, the species hasn't a real being as the things have. It is only an intentional.
Odile, can you hear me? Did we just lose Odile, or is it only my connection?
I can't hear her either.
Right.
Her image is...
No, me neither.
And probably just leave it as it is. I mean, without the...
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know what happened. It's the first time. It's always like this, like that.
It's fine.
When you present internet problems. So the quotations, as I said, says that the species imissa non est materie tantum nec forme sed totius compositi. And this species, which don't have esse without material conditions, has material conditions sub esse spirituali. This strange expression will be explained later in a further quotation. Here I work like in Inquisitio, which is the particularity of this first part of the commentary of the first proposition of libre causis in Roger Bacon's work. It works like an Inquisitio. So the expression sub esse spirituali will be explained in the next question. Therefore, before going to the question 3, the final answer to the question if the matter caused by influence is no, it doesn't. But because the form, which is the active part of the composition, doesn't operate without material conditions, so does its similitude, which is the similitude of the form, but which doesn't act without material conditions, sub esse spirituali. Just a last remark. If the species isn't only an intentional being, but something substantial and active, that is always accompanied by material conditions, then are these material conditions its own matter, or are they borrowed, so to speak, material conditions? For instance, does the species of heat have different material conditions when it is in the fire, in the air that the fire warms, or in the flesh that the fire warms, or in the material things or in the soul? In his later works, Bacon will support this last hypothesis. This could mean then that the Quaestiones already developed an idea which is considered by the specialists as specific to Bacon's later works. The question 3 about corporeal substances asks about the substances considered as efficient causes, and these substances considered as efficient causes can be divided in 2 or 3 kinds: the corporeal ones, the uncorporeal ones, or spirituals, and the artificial ones. It is maybe a division coming from Avicii now. Let's begin with the corporeal ones. The argumentation is here so obscure that I will give you my own interpretation without highlighting some details that are still unresolved. What is it? The first argument, as you see it on the slide, says the argument contra, videtur quod non, says that the species, which is the vestigium of a corporeal agent, is a similitude of this agent. This means that the similitude of something which has 3 dimensions also has 3 dimensions, and the 3-dimensional similitude is received in another body which has also 3 dimensions. The problem is then, as says the argument, that 2 dimensions will be joined or stick together. The next argument says, tu dices, you say, that it isn't a problem because the vestigium is sufficiently separated from the vero esse naturale, that is, probably the esse naturale of the receiving body. What is obscure to me is the reason why the argument doesn't say 2 bodies in place of 2 dimensions, in reference to the book 4 of Aristotle's Physics, which mentions that 2 bodies cannot occupy the same place at the same time. The reference of 2 dimensions, that is, to a surface, makes you think that the problem is to distinguish between the surface of the agent, that of the patient, and that of the trace itself. The contact surface doesn't offer any distance nor any distinction between the agent, the patient, and the trace of the agent in the patient. The consequence of this argument, which is still obscure to me, is clear. The consequence, not the argument itself, but the consequence is clear. It is that if the agent is sticked together with the patient, it cannot flow in it because the influence is an action at a distance. A very important criterion to define the influence appears here. To inflow is to act at a distance. What that means that the agent must be locally away from the patient. We'll come back to this very important criterion later. 2 arguments are opposed to this first one. The first argument contra, ad oppositum, is clearer than the second one. The first one says that, and it has nothing to do with the problem of dimensions. The first one says that if the corporeal agent does have any impact on its patient, it must perfect in it what is perfect in itself. Not only the internal power does perfect the active power, so something external to the patient, remote and different from it, must act on it. But, and here is the second argument contra, which is an answer to the first argument pro. Moreover, and it is the second argument, which is an obscure, as obscure as the first one, I confess. So I will try to translate it literally before analyze it with another passage in the rest of the Quaestiones. Nor the dimensions under the spiritual being, nor the 2 dimensions under the material being, but the dimensions are unsuitable to the formal being, as said in Book 4 of Aristotle's Physics. If you don't agree with this translation, I will be happy to have your advice, your interpretation, because this passage is very, very complicated. Happily, there is another passage further in the Quaestiones that will help us to clarify some of these elements. And I put it on the following page. Here. It is said in this passage, in this quotation, that the corporeal species has dimensions, or more precisely, that it is under dimensions, but that must be well understood. Actually, it doesn't mean that the species has itself corporeal dimensions, otherwise the soul could never abstract its corporeal conditions to understand it. So that means that corporeal dimensions are not part of the essence, if we can say, of the species. Therefore, there is a difference, says Bacon, between the terminated dimensions, which are specific to the natural things, and the non-terminated or unterminated dimensions, which are in the first matter and can be received in the soul. That is peculiar to the argument later in the Quaestiones. But anyway, the distinction between terminated dimensions and non-terminated dimensions does interest us. These undetermined dimensions are sub esse spirituali. What does it mean? Huh? These undetermined dimensions mean that the species rei corporalis potest dici corporalis a corpore quod est substantia. That is, the solution brought to the problem of dimensions in the passage we have seen before, that is in the first part of the commentary of the first proposition. Actually, I will try to explain it. The body can be considered in two ways. The first is the corporeal entity as a substance, and as a substance it is active and has dimensions sub esse spirituali. The second is as a quantity, but as a quantity, the body, which has actually three dimensions, length, width, and depth, cannot be active because the quantity is a category of matter, and the matter isn't active in any way. And what's more, because it isn't an active agent, quantity cannot multiply the species, while the emissio speciae fit via multiplicationis, says the text. That means that the emission of species is a multiplication of species. Therefore, when it is a three-dimensional quantity, the body cannot have corporeal dimensions sub esse spirituali. To try to summarize, the answer to the initial question, which was if the corporeal substances act by influence, the answer is yes, they do, but only if these substances are taken as substances and not as quantities. Moreover, it has been said that their mode of influence is the multiplication of spaces. I give another and further explanation, and after that I stop just to have your questions or remarks. What is noteworthy here is that two of the Baconian specific notions are linked. The fact that the species isn't only a formal entity, but shares a kind of materiality, so to speak, with the middle inside which it acts. And the fact that influence of virtues is, at last concerning the corporeal substances, a multiplication of species. Even more troubling is the fact that the book Perspectiva of Alhazen is mentioned by one of the speakers in the discussion previous in the Quaestiones. I didn't put the quotations in the slide because there are so many quotations. So there is a quotation before this quotation you see on your slide that talks about the Perspectiva. This is the only quotation of Perspectiva in the Quaestiones. The reference to the multiplication of light and color is explicitly present in the argument of this speaker, talking about Perspectiva, but doesn't arouse any reaction from Bacon to explain this multiplication with the help of the technical vocabulary of optics, as he will make it later in the Communium Naturalium and in the De Multiplicatione Speciarum. Following the specialists, Bacon has begun to study optics around 1247, that is, at the time, precisely, when he is supposed to have finished his commentary on the Liber causis. So maybe maybe he read it because it is mentioned, but anyway, he doesn't make anything, if I can say, of this mechanical explanation of the spread of species. No conclusion can be drawn at this stage, but it is interesting to notice that the libre de causis and the horizon of Neoplatonic texts mentioned in Bacon's commentary as Pseudo-Denis, Boethius, and the authors of the 12th century could be the first occurrence of a theory of the multiplication of species, generally considered, for Bacon, as a consequence of the interest of Bacon in optics. I would like just to stop here to have your questions or remarks, because I have so much things to say. I'm afraid that all these elements would be explained maybe too rapidly. So I will go on further, but don't hesitate to interrupt me when necessary, because I have a rhythm that is maybe too rapid for some things. So don't hesitate. Well, the further question is on the side of Pseudo-Henry. It's the question 5, talking about the agente intra. If you remember well the structure of Pseudo-Henry's commentary, the first efficient cause was the first cause. Then we had the other efficient causes, but extra, that were intelligences and corporal celestial substances, and then come the agents that are inside the patient, that is forma rei, the form. And on the side of Roger Bacon, the form is analyzed at the very end of the analysis. Though there is a shift once again in the structure between both commentaries. The fourth question is about the agente spirituali, that is the uncorporeal substances, the intelligences. We have a first argument that is quite close to Pseudo-Henry's argument, that the intelligences are limited by the limits, if I can say, of their own matter. They cannot go further or extra their own matter, so that they cannot diffuse something outside themselves. They cannot diffuse, to be precise, something of themselves outside themselves. This argument is often mentioned further in the Quaestiones, and means that the first cause and the universal causes cannot act by diffusion of themselves or by something of themselves. Maybe the problem is the same as in the Neoplatonical text. That is the problem of the loss of substance. To flow doesn't mean, at least for these substances, the uncorporeal substances and the first cause, doesn't mean to lose something of themselves. But on the contrary, as David Lindbergh stated it, to flow for the natural and particular substances is to multiplicate their virtues. And this is a mean for Bacon to explain the process of loss of energy, if I can say, of loss of species in nature. So that there is a difference between the first cause and on one side the first cause and the universal causes, so-called intelligences, and on the other side the natural causes that are particular causes that are submitted to a process of multiplication. The argument, on the contrary, for this question is particularly weak, if I can say, because roughly speaking, I didn't put it on the slides, roughly speaking, if the corporeal substances flow, the uncorporeal must flow, because what the superior causes can do, or what the inferior causes can do. Well, this is a principle we can find in many texts till the end of the 13th century, even in Duns Scotus. But it doesn't help to understand or to give an argument against the first argument. So let's move to the solution and the answer to the arguments. In itself, that means in its own nature, the intelligence cannot diffuse itself according to the substance nor according to the virtus. I will come back again to this very important difference according to the substance and according to the virtus. But then, how can the intelligence flow? Due to the virtus received from a superior cause, that is, the first cause. An important principle appears here. The natural causes, the creatures, cannot act without the virtues of the first cause, which is ultimately the real and only cause. And an important distinction appears also, the distinction between what acts according to the substance and what acts according to the virtues. I will once again open a parenthesis, if I can say, to explain what this distinction means. And at last I will try to do it, because actually I didn't find any clear definition of this distinction, even in the Quaestiones in Librum de causis, and in the Quaestiones, the other treatises of the same period. So, at first sight, it seems that to act according to the substance is to act according to the essence, that is, to the nature of the agent. This means that the agent acts in itself without any intermediate principle, such as the virtues. However, to act according to the substance has several meanings. The first meaning is when the agent is inside the patient. Then the simple presence of the agent suffices. It is enough to act. In this case, the agent is said to act by its substance. For instance, the form, which is inside the composite, as the soul is in the body, acts substantially by its substance, that means by its own essence, that means that it is present to the whole composite. Well, the second meaning is when the agent is outside the patient. And then there are two more possibilities. The first one is when the agent is sticked to the patient. This is the action by contact. And this action by contact is most of the time identified with the action according to the substance in the scholastic text. But these texts are later than the Quaestiones in Librum de causis, later than the Roger Bacon's work, than Roger Bacon Quaestiones, sorry. The second possibility is when the agent is removed from the patient. This is the action at a distance, which is most of the time identified with the action with the virtues, that is, with an intermediate principle. Well, the problem at the action of this at a distance is well known in the scholastic period. I won't give you explanation about that because it's too huge problem. But anyway, what is interesting to underline here is that the action at a distance isn't possible according to the substance. In other words, the contact is necessary to act according to the substance. But in this case, the action according to the substance refers to a local or physical distance and not a metaphysical one, so to speak, like the action by its own essence. Therefore, the distinction act according to a substance, that is act by contact, versus act according to a virtus, that is an act at a distance, this distinction doesn't entirely satisfy me. Actually, there seems to be a kind of confusion between what I could call a metaphysical point of view. It's quite exaggerated, but it's to make a difference. A metaphysical point of view, that is the action by its own essence, and a physical one, that is the action at a distance or without any distance, or the local action. As we will see further in the explanation, it isn't enough, says Bacon, to be essentially distant to act by influence. It is also necessary to be locally distant. And on the side of the action according to the virtues, it isn't clearer because there can be also two possibilities to understand it, as Bacon stands it. The first one is to act according to the virtues is to emit a virtus or a species, that means to diffuse something of its own essence or substance. And the second possibility is to emit a virtus, to educe, if I can translate literally, to educe something, a virtus, from an active potentiality which is included inside matter of the patient. And this eduction is something between the influence, strictly speaking, the diffusion of itself, and the production or impression of something new in the patient. So you see that the meaning of acting according to the virtues is broadened to another sense, that is the eduction. This distinction will be clarified later in the following question, because the arguments are successive, like an inquisitor, as I said before. Another question is about the artificial agents. The question 5, which is question 6 in Pseudo-Henry's commentary. The artificial agents are the instruments. Bacon doesn't mention any example of instruments, but in another treaty of the same period, he talks about the potion or the drug of the doctor. One argument in favor of the influence of the artificial agent is that the artifact induces transmutations or dispositions or other things inside the patient. And actually, the artifact helps the agent to transmute the patient. That is, without this artifact, the agent could not act on the patient. For instance, the doctor could not heal the patient without the drug. Nevertheless, says the opposite argument, the artifact acts only by touching the surface of the patient, which appears here to be a weakness because it supposes that the artifact doesn't emit any virtus. On the contrary, it needs to be in strong contact with the surface of the patient. And as we have already seen it before, the action by influence must be an action at a distance. Therefore, the artifact doesn't act by influence. This last argument is considered by Bacon. You see it in the solution. If the artifact could act by influence, by emitting virtus, it would act day and night. So there would be no more need of nuclear power, for example. The instrument would be working day and night. And however, it is true that the artifact transmutes the patient so that it could be conceded, broadly speaking, that it acts by influence, but the name of influence must be then extended to another sense, that to act at a distance by emitting virtus. And the condition to endorse this broad meaning is to conceive the influence, in this case, as the production of a virtus as the ultimate form of the patient. For instance, this is my example, I'm not sure Bacon would have said like that. For instance, the process of constructing a table must be completed until the table is constructed. Or for example, the health of the patient must be totally recovered. That means that the virtus is also, broadly speaking, the ultimate forma, the ultimate form of the whole thing. And this sheds some trouble on, once more, on the meaning of influence, because the distinction between the strict sense of influence, that is for natural agents, and the broad sense, which is conceded to the artifact, splits the previous nuance, saying that the influence cannot be, strictly speaking, a diffusion of itself. Let's say, then, that the real difference between the natural causes and the artifact is that the first one, the natural cause, emits virtues, whereas the second doesn't, but both natural and artificial causes both induce transmutations inside the patient, and are equally said to act by influence. But it shed troubles because the concession given to the artifact splits the previous precision in the text that has been made, saying that a cause by influence, which acts by its influence, cannot diffuse herself or cannot diffuse something of herself, of itself. Sorry. Then comes the question. Sorry, the question 6. What is the real shift in the explanation? I don't explain to me why it appears like that in the structure of Bacon's work. It breaks the explanation with a new classification, a kind of recapitulation of the case of all the efficient causes. As it is said, queritur utrum illud debet verificari in omnibus agentibus naturalibus. And this occurs with the help of new distinctions. The distinction between universal and particular causes, and the distinction between external and internal causes. Some of these cases have been already seen before, and that is the reason why I consider this question 6 as a kind of summary of the previous cases, in addition with some new cases. Firstly, the distinction between universal and particular causes. I will give you directly the solution. The arguments are relatively clear, so I cannot give you the solution. Both the universal and the particular substances are said to act by influence. That means that all natural causes act by influence, at last if they are efficient, because both are at a distance of the patient. The first, the universal cause, is obviously at a distance of the surface, says the argument, and of the depth of the patient, whereas the particular cause is only at a distance of the depth of the patient, but not of the surface, because it is the cause that is closest to the patient. Therefore, the universal cause must be said to inflow more than the particular one, but both are recognized to act by influence. And what is surprising here is that the distinction that we have seen previously between the action by contact and the action at a distance disappears, so to speak. So it is possible that in an exaggerated interpretation, there is no question of surface or depth, indeed, but that when an agent touches either the middle or the patient directly, it induces from the potentia activa a species or a virtus that is an active force that transmutes all the first part of this middle or of this patient, and that transmuting this part being, so to say, itself a new species produced by the middle or the patient, this part touches the second part and successively to the depth of the patient successively reaches the transmutation of the patient. I try to be clear to explain this process, which is not explained here in the questionnaires, but which is explained further later in the Communium Naturalium, because it is troubling here to say that the depth of the patient is not really an essential depth, but maybe it is the depth like the uttermost part of the patient that hasn't been yet reached by the force of the agent. Of course, it is an exaggerated interpretation, I know, but it helps to understand why describing the universal and the particular causes as both acting by influence, even the particular causes, because they touch, the particular cause touches the patient. Even the particular causes are recognized to act by influence. And this can only be explained if, of course, it could be explained if the depth is something like essential, but it doesn't resolve the confusion said before. But if we understand the depth of the substance here, like the uttermost part of the patient that hasn't been yet reached by the force of the agent, then the solution of Bacon is quite close to the solution he will give in the theory of multiplication of species in Communium Naturalium. Well, I won't draw such conclusions, but it is a possible interpretation. What about the external and internal agents? This is the following slides. We have already seen the case of the external agents, and the internal agent is the potentia activa in materia. Here, another problem, once more. It is important to notice, and this is thanks to Dragos, because we worked on this manuscript during the last summer, and he helped me a lot to understand how to revise the edition. It is important to notice that 17 lines are missing in the manuscripts. That makes about 26 lines in the edition, quite a lot. After the beginning of the second argument pro in this question. So we don't have the whole question. No question is missing actually in the whole text, because the next question is corresponds to the main table, but there is a gap in the argumentation in the question we're analyzing. So it could be quite sad because the concept of potentia activa is very important, and it is so important that the word appears with many occurrences in Quaestiones in Librum de causis, but also in the Quaestiones on metaphysics that could be have written before the Quaestiones on Librum de causis. And potentia activa is described, defined, and justified in this treaty before being used in the Quaestiones in Librum de causis. Here, in the as far as we understand the manuscript, because the gap doesn't allow to draw consequences, to draw conclusions, but anyway, the concept of potentia activa is presented as such. There is no explanation. Maybe this is not only because there is a gap in the manuscript, but also because it has been explained at length, sorry for my English pronunciation, in a previous treaty, the metaphysical treaty. That's maybe the reason. Anyway, the question then is not to know if there is a potentia activa in matter, but if this potentia activa acts by influence inside the patient. And the first argument let us know that the potentia activa is an incomplete form, and the form is not by itself efficient, otherwise there would be no distinction between the formal cause and the efficient cause. And the efficient cause here is nothing else than the virtus externally emitted by the agent. The second argument is incomplete. I didn't put it on the slide. The argument, on the contrary, says that so we have a gap between both of them, says that the potentia activa cannot act by influence because it is present to the whole composite of matter and form. And the answer of Bacon is clear. Here, it can be considered that the potentia activa acts by influence only if it is excited by an external agent, which is the virtus emitted by an external agent. We can see here more precisely that the influence is a two-dimensional process. The agent must be external and removed from the uttermost parts of the patient. That could be the depth mentioned previously. This is a strong interpretation. And the agent touches the surface of the patient as the particular agent does, so that it excites a potentia activa present inside the patient. This passage doesn't say, however, that a virtus is then produced. It insists, on the contrary, on the virtus emitted by the agent. But the process of multiplication could be indirectly explained here. The agent touches the surface of the patient, which isn't a surface in a proper manner, that is, with two dimensions, but a real part of the patient, like if it had three dimensions, inside which a potentia activa is excited by the virtue of the agents, producing a new virtus or species that has the active power to transmute the following part of the patient, and so on, until the so-called depth of the patient. But I confess the explanation is far from being explicitly developed in Bacon's Quaestiones. Well, last but not least, and thank you for having so much patience to listen to me. The last question, and I will give you after that some time to ask questions or reactions. The question 7 is about the formal and final cause, which in Pseudo-Henry's commentary is split in two parts. The first part was before, it was the previous part on the internal agent, if you remember this structure, and the second part is here about the final causes. And the first reaction when we read the following question is, why does Bacon speak of the form, whereas he has already presented a solution in the previous question about the potentia activa? But because the answer is simple, because this form here isn't taken in the same meaning as the potentia activa, it is the complete form, not the incomplete one, just as is the potentia activa. And the complete form, or the ultimate form, is the form that completes entirely the substance of the patient. We can see here that generation is a process that takes time. It is not in an instant. It is not immediate. So that the form is first incomplete, like a potentia activa, waiting for, in another treatise, Bacon says, appetit formam, desiring its form, its ultimate form. And this potentia activa or incomplete form is waiting for further forms that complete the first form till the complete form accomplishes the whole thing. So it is not Aristotelian at all, this kind of conception of the form. And maybe Bacon saw the difficulty in the Aristotelian explanation, that is, it is like a magical act, if I can say, when we start from the potentia and we and to the actuality. He wanted to explain it with steps that are the forma incompleta and the forma completa. Bacon starts with the case of the final cause, and I will try to summarize the problems here. A first argument says that if the efficient cause is said to lead, if I can say the thing, to its necessity, to its accomplishment, its final and complete state, and if the efficient cause is said to be to act by influence, as we have seen, then the final cause must also be said to accompany the patient to its complete state. That means to act by influence. Moreover, the final cause couldn't be reached if there were no representation species of this cause. This is an interpretation, a psychological interpretation of the species, as we talked about 1 hour ago with Dragos. This is an example. The argument contra says that the final cause doesn't transmute really the patient, but only metaphorically. Doesn't have any real action on the patient. This is a well-known expression that we find also at the end of the 13th century in Duns Scotus. To act metaphorically means not to act really, not to have a real effect on the patient. We stop here in the explanation because I cannot compare Duns Scotus with Bacon. This would need more researchers to know where this expression comes. But anyway, it means that the agent, the final cause, doesn't have any real action on the patient. This last argument is conceded, even if, says Bacon, the final cause could be said acting by influence if it is taken as an efficient cause. So here we can say that, like in the pseudo-Henry's commentary, Bacon reduces the action by influence to the action of efficient causes. It could be an argument of this reduction of causality by influence to the efficient causality. And the answer to the arguments are more interesting. Sorry, I didn't put the right slide. See, and then I am a genius in in informatics. So actually, talking about the species as a representative entity is to limitate the species to a psychological or noetical context, whereas the species emitted by an agent is on the contrary something active, a force that can be compared and even identified to a virtus. And this is the first time, it's quite strange structure of this Quaestiones, because this is the first time that Bacon justifies the identification between species and virtus, whereas at the very beginning of the commentary, no justification has been made of this synonym. And what about the form? This will be the end of my presentation. Two arguments speak in favor of the influence of the form. The first is because even if the form is present everywhere in the patient, it acts by influence, just as the heart emits virtus to the other parts of the organic body. And the second is less interesting. Takes an example of the commentator. The argument, on the contrary, repeats the idea of the presence of the form in the composite to conclude that it is a sufficient reason to reject its action by influence, because it isn't at a distance compared to the patient. To understand these arguments, it is necessary to distinguish two meanings of the form. Duplex est forma. First, the form as the act of matter doesn't act by influence, says Bacon, because it is everywhere present in the patient. The form as the act of matter means the complete and ultimate form, as well as the incomplete one, that is the potentia activa. And if I can say that, it is because of the help of Pseudo-Henry's commentary that clearly distinguishes between the forma incompleta and the forma completa as two kinds of act of matter. But there is another kind of form that is called hoc aliquid, which is added in some part of the composite. This hoc aliquid has, says Bacon, an esse additum, a being added, an added esse, which acts on the parts of the patient that are removed from it, just as the heart acts by influence on the removed parts of the organic body. And in this case, it acts not as a formal cause, but as an esse additum. What is this esse additum? Well, it seems to me to be a kind of increase or surplus of being, surely of dignity, maybe of being, because it's called esse additum, just as the heart is closer to the essence of man than his stomach, something like that. But anyway, I didn't find any occurrence of this esse additum in the other part of, in the rest of the Quaestiones, nor in the other treaties of the same period. But anyway, this esse additum acts by influence, but it's not as formal causes that it acts. And the rest of our argumentation puts a distinction between two meanings of the virtus, dico quod virtus uno modo et secondo modo. First is as potentia ultima. In this case, the virtus is the same as the complete form of the thing. In this sense, the formal cause is said to emit virtus, not strictly speaking, but by the means of the virtus that is the complete form. Secondly, strictly speaking, however, a virtus is an inflow of virtus or species thrown in a part of matter, like the fire emits a species in the matter of air. Therefore, it is not only in the extended sense of influence that influence is a diffusion of virtus. And to summarize, the incomplete form or the potentia activa cannot act by influence because it is present to the whole composite. The complete form cannot act by influence except if it is said to act by the means of the virtus, which is the complete form of the composite. And the complete form as an esse additum acts only as an esse additum and not as a formal cause. Therefore, the formal cause doesn't act by influence except in a broad sense. I will try to draw some conclusion before having your questions and remarks on this very difficult text. What can be concluded? Firstly, it seems to me that the analysis of the causality by influence by Bacon is a kind of reduction of the causality by influence to the efficient causality, even if some concessions are made, only if the other kind of causes, the material, the formal, and the final, are reduced to the efficient dimensions. What does it mean? First, that all the efficient causes caused by influence were the universal or particular, and the other, material, formal, and final causes, act only in a broad sense by influence. Matter doesn't act by influence except if it is taken as the material conditions necessary to the act of the form. Form doesn't act by influence, except in a broad sense, that is, the incomplete form, the potentia activa, is said to act by influence only if it receives a virtus emitted by an external agent, and the complete form, on the other side, is said to act by influence in a broad sense only if it is considered as a virtus produced by the potentia activa when it is excited by a virtus emitted by the agent. The final cause, the last one, doesn't act by influence except if it is taken as what leads the thing to its necessity or its completion. Sorry for my English pronunciation, it's not as correct as it could be. Sorry. The similarity between both commentaries, Bacon's one and Söderhamri's one, could let think that this analysis is a kind of intellectual topos. I talked about it with Tragus. That has become necessary, if I can say, in a Christian context to reduce the exemplarity of the formal cause of the libre de causis to an efficient cause, producing all things by his will and not automatically. The case of the first cause is quite interesting. The first cause causes by will and by influence, if influence means the principle of information, the virtus, infused inside the whole nature as the cause of the other causes, the power of all the powers. This prevents us from considering the influence as an emanation. The virtus is infused by creation, and because it causes the power of causation of the natural causes, it prevents them to be reduced to a simple mechanical and blind process. Moreover, even if the analysis of the causality by influence looks more like an inquisitio, a work in progress, unlike the Pseudo-Henry's commentary, some characteristics of the notions of causality by influence can be drawn, raising the following questions. Firstly, is the potentia activa an innovation of Bacon, as Anna Rodolphi says? We cannot conclude this at this stage because the notion of potentia activa is presented in Bacon's Quaestiones and in his commentary on metaphysics as very important, and in later treatises as Communium Naturalium, there is just one occurrence of the expression potentia activa, and he uses rather the expression potentia materiae. So maybe the Quaestiones on the Librum de causis present a previous state of the question. What it is? Maybe. Second question, is the species defined with a form and a matter, as Yael Kedra says, and how is described the multiplication of species in the Quaestiones? We have seen that the Quaestiones maintains that the species has material conditions. That means that dimensions of the species are in quantitative dimensions, but the dimensions of the corporeal or incorporeal entities in which it acts. Also, the Quaestiones maintain, in the same time, that the influence of virtus is the same as the multiplication of species. This is explicitly said. And this multiplication of species isn't nevertheless technically described as a spread of species, as in the later commentaries, as in the Communium Naturalium, even if the treaty Perspectiva of Alhazen is mentioned only once. Can we draw the same conclusion as Yael Kedra in a recent article, that the definition of species as a form having the dimensions of the entity it acts upon is peculiar to Bacon and is related to the mechanism of multiplication of species? If it was the case, the Quaestiones should develop the technical features of the mechanism of spread. However, several differences appear between the explanation given in the Quaestiones and the explanation given in the Communium Naturalium, for instance. I took only 3 differences. First, the criterion to define the action by influence stays the criterion of an action at a distance. Second, the technical characteristics of the mechanism of multiplication is missing in the Quaestiones, even if a reference is made to the perspectiva. And the third difference is that the material conditions of the species stay obscure to me, naturally, not in se. But in any case, the explanation that the species has the dimensions of the entity it acts upon is missing. There is no explicit mention of that. It is possible that the theory explained in the Quaestiones corresponds to an early stage of Bacon's thought, and that he will gradually be aware of the implications of optics in the later treatise. It is also possible that the aim of the Quaestiones is other than the communium naturarum. It is more metaphysical, and that it draws from metaphysical sources rather than physical ones. Well, I will stop here, otherwise you will not have the patience anymore to ask questions. And thank you very much for your patience and attentive listening. Well.
We thank you very much. I thank you very much, and we all thank you very much for this effort to explain us a really complicated text in many aspects.